says like, yeah, you know, after you receive this, it's going to be 5 to 7 days after you'll get your refund. After I don't even know how many fucking times I try to get it, because like the chat person on there, they're like, oh no, well, Apple projects it can be up to a month. And I'm like, that's just fucking nowhere in here. Like, no, you're gonna fucking refund this. Like, ended up like disputing things with like chicks because I'm like, no, fuck you. Like, nowhere did it say something. I'm not leaving $1,000 on my like credit card balance. Like, while I just wait for you to return this. Eventually, got them to refund one of them. But one got refunded. Chase says it was them. Amazon was like, it was us. Got the other one that eventually refunded through Amazon. And then after I like, Chase was like, what's that? And then they refunded a third time. So like that one I had free basically right now. I was like, oh, we figure out the charges, whatever. I'm like, I'm done with Prime. This is garbage. Like, not worth it at all. Took all my committees off there. Stuff too. When they're like, oh, well, we refunded that. I'm like, Chase says they refunded it, not you. I'm not seeing you. You work it out with them. So currently I have $500 like free backup, but we're gonna like, I'm assuming that Chase is gonna like add the charge back at one point there, but yeah, so I'm just saying, you know, that's
can't do that.
Hey, I'm sorry. Have this charge here for now. We'll see if it comes back. But yeah, like, it's just a nightmare.
So did you end up getting it for free?
Right now, yeah, but I'm sure they're gonna figure out the charge back when they put it on there. But for now,
Did you try it out to make sure that
yeah, I checked it. It seems like everything's good. They said like the seller could use something. It was just like Amazon itself trying to deliver. How you doing?
Yeah, my one of the places for Christmas, Costco. So this particular bike, and it's on sale in Costco, but and I went on the website was like a lot more money. So I'm gonna order it through Costco. It's like one of these online things you couldn't buy it in the store. I had to look it up. So she tells me what it is, shows me. I try to find it online. I couldn't find it anywhere. So it's a free so then I call up customer service, Costco. And the guy's like, I can't find it either. I'm like, okay. So I tell my wife, I feel like I can't find this bike, and I call customer service. They can't find it. My wife is like, it was just on there the other day. So she goes on, finds it online. I said, look, if you can find it, you can buy it. Just buy it. You know? And then of course she complains to my daughter that I had to buy my own Christmas present. I was like, well, I tried. And then,
I haven't come on these before with British TV idea. Can I get down here and ask a question?
Yes.
Because the camera has to
Yes.
Yeah, you can't
I
set up.
can
You
have
can't.
one
Yeah, you
question.
just can't like shoot up. You can't like shoot a stand up down here or whatever.
Okay, but I can
Yeah,
ask a question.
if
Yes.
someone comes, yeah,
Great, thank you.
no problem.
yeah, all the camera people have to be up here, because then
Right.
if they're down here, then it blocks like the
Yeah,
guys and stuff.
yeah, okay, fine.
But yeah, they all line up along that road.
Are you guys with UNTV? Or
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And the Gaza vote, is that going to be on
They don't tell us.
Sometimes we know up front, and sometimes you want staff to come over and say, hey, at 1:30 there's going to be an event today.
Okay.
And sometimes they just walk over.
Right, okay. And just kind of have a chat.
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. We're good.
So, yeah, so
camera check.
So it's kind of like sometimes
Oh,
it's
yeah.
scripted and sometimes it's unscripted.
Right, yeah. And in terms of watching the actual debate, it's going to be UNTV.
Yeah. Yeah.
Buenos días.
A very good morning. The 9,512th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. At the outset of the meeting, I should like, at the request of the delegation of the United Arab Emirates and on behalf of the members of the Security Council, to ask that all those present now stand and join in observing a minute of silence to present its condolences and sympathy to the government and people of Kuwait on the occasion of the passing away of Sheikh Nawash al-Hamad al-Shaber al-Sabah, the late Emir of Kuwait.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
En el orden del día provisional.
The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation concerning the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The agenda is adopted. In line with Rule 37 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure of the Council, I invite the representative of the DRC to participate in this meeting. It is so agreed. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2023/932, the report of the Secretary-General on the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Members of the Council have before them document S/2023/1000, the text of a draft resolution submitted by France. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/1000 please raise their hand? The result of the voting is as follows. The draft resolution received 15 votes in favour. The draft resolution has been adopted unanimously as Resolution 2717, 2023. I will now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by welcoming the presence of the distinguished representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo to this meeting. The 8th, we commend the delegation of France for its tireless efforts in achieving a unanimous adoption of the draft resolution renewing MONUSCO's mandate. We also acknowledge the positive contribution that other delegations played in support of the African cause during negotiations of the draft resolution, and particularly express our gratitude to the permanent mission of the DRC for its support and effective cooperation. The 8th, we voted in favor of the draft resolution because we believe that it signifies an effort on the part of the penholder to bridge widely divergent views expressed from negotiations on a plethora of issues in the DRC, which have a direct bearing on MONUSCO's mandate, such as human rights, armed groups, and regional support, among others. While we appreciate the commitment of this Council to ensuring the timely renewal of MONUSCO's mandate, we also note that language in certain crucial aspects of the just adopted resolution, especially pertaining to the level and amount of logistical and operational support MONUSCO should be allowed to provide to regional forces, was placed under an overwhelming scrutiny during negotiations and severely weakened as a result. The A3 wishes to stress in the context of MONUSCO's impending withdrawal and associated transitional activities that regional forces, including the incoming SADC mission in the DRC, represent an effective tool for peace enforcement in the DRC, especially as armed and terrorist groups continue to unleash an unending cycle of terror on the Congolese population. We believe that limitations on support to regional forces by MONUSCO are inimical to the regional effort toward the consolidation of peace and security in the DRC. Mr. President, the A3 nevertheless reaffirms its firm belief in the primacy of a political solution in the DRC. In this regard, we note that the reversal of the dire security and humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC requires an integrated regional approach and strong political engagement by relevant stakeholders, including the government of the DRC, the AU, the ICGLR, and ASADC. Mr. President, permit me to turn this Council's attention to another issue of considerable importance. The government of the DRC, in the face of significant economic, infrastructure, and security challenges, is demonstrating commitment to protecting civilians from violations. Although we believe that violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by all perpetrators in the DRC are inexcusable and should be punished, we hold the view that the attribution of certain categories of violations to the entire armed forces of the DRC should be avoided. On this note, the A3, during negotiations on the just adopted resolution, insisted that certain violations by some non-conforming members of the FARDC should not be generalized as violations by the entire FARDC. We believe that the Congolese government, through its armed forces, remains committed to the protection of civilians. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating the A3's strong support for the brotherly country of the DRC, as well as for the stabilizing activities of MONUSCO. We also reiterate A3's strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the DRC, and recall the importance of the principles of non-interference, good neighborliness, and regional cooperation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also welcome the representative of the DRC to this meeting. Mr. President, the United States is proud to have voted in favor of this resolution, which clearly responds to the Democratic Republic of Congo's request to change the status quo, while maintaining the mission's core responsibility to protect civilians amidst its gradual, responsible, and sustainable withdrawal. The United States also appreciates that the Council responded quickly and favorably to the DRC government's formal request for MONUSCO to provide logistical support to national elections in North Kivu, South Kivu, Ituri, and other provinces. We now look to the DRC government to ensure that all Congolese are able to safely and meaningfully participate in the elections, regardless of political affiliation and without fear of violence or reprisal. It is incumbent on Congolese institutions to fulfill their constitutional mandates with the independence and integrity that the Congolese people expect and deserve. But colleagues, we know that democracy does not end at the ballot box. In fact, it is what comes next that truly matters. While we supported the Council's efforts to extend the UN's electoral assistance to the DRC, we also underscore our call on all political actors and segments of society to respect the will of the people and engage actively, constructively, and peacefully, regardless of the election's result. The coming days and months mark a pivotal moment for the DRC and MONUSCO. Members of this Council will be watching very closely as the DRC government looks to assume full responsibility for the protection of its civilians as MONUSCO draws down. By working together, the DRC and MONUSCO can bring more than 2 decades of peacekeeping to a dignified and sustainable close, ushering in a new chapter of peace and prosperity for the country and its people. The United States commends SRSG Keda and her team for continuing to implement MONUSCO's mandate in the face of great challenges, and we look forward to continuing our strong support to the mission over the coming year. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I welcome the representative of the DRC to this meeting. Since this is the last opportunity my delegation will have to address this Council on the situation in the DRC and the MONUSCO mandate, I would like to extend our sincere appreciation for the efforts carried out by the pen holder in driving the negotiation process forward in close consultation with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We also extend our appreciation to all Council members for their constructive engagement in achieving this outcome. The adopted resolution takes into account our main concerns on the transition process, which will be a very challenging task. MONUSCO's departure should be done responsibly, avoiding potential risks of more violence against the population. We emphasize the need to guarantee the safety and security of MONUSCO's personnel during the entire withdrawal process. We reiterate the need that the transition and withdrawal must be well coordinated with neighboring countries and relevant regional actors. We welcome the fact that the adopted text considered those factors. Brazil reaffirms its commitment to peace, stability, and development in the DRC and assures all stakeholders of our continuing support. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the DRC.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on behalf of the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and on behalf of the people of the Congo, we would like to very warmly thank the Security Council, first of all, for having acceded to our request and for having done this in regular time. The request to expand the logistical support of MONUSCO to provinces in the DRC, those which were not initially under its current mandate, and to do this so as to make the current electoral process more effective. This process has arrived at the end of the campaign, and the electoral process per se has begun, and this will allow the people of Congo to go to vote tomorrow. We would like to also thank the members of the Security Council and the Secretary General of the United Nations. We thank them for the efforts made, and most specifically France, the A3, and all of the partner countries, members of the Security Council, with whom we worked very closely so as to make the adoption today of this resolution possible, which enshrines the implementation of the provisions which were agreed by the United Nations and the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as regards MONUSCO. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for their statement. As there are no further requests for the floor, the meeting stands adjourned.
Buenos días.
A very good morning. The 9,513th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Major General Patrick Gochat, Head of Mission and Chief of Staff of the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, I'm devoting my regular briefing on the situation in the Middle East to the 28th report of the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. The Secretary General's written report covers the period between 19 September and 7 December. As the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza rages on, 2023 ends as one of the deadliest in the history of this conflict, with the situation deteriorating on nearly all fronts. Mr. President, since the end of the written reporting period, hostilities have continued inside Gaza as Israeli forces advances further into Khan Yunis in the southern part of the Strip, and intensified operation in reported Hamas strongholds in the north, in Jabalia refugee camp and in Shushaiyeh neighborhood, as well as in Kamal Alwan hospital. Intensive Israeli airstrikes continue across the Strip. Over 1,000 more fatalities, overwhelmingly Palestinians, have taken place. The toll on civilians, including women and children, remains unbearable. With more than 100 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas, the Israeli army announced it had retrieved the bodies of 3 hostages, 2 from tunnels in Jabalia refugee camp and 1 woman. On 15 December, the IDF said that Israeli soldiers has mistakenly shot and killed 3 hostages in Shushaiyeh. Hamas and other militant factions have also continued to indiscriminately fire rockets at areas in southern and central Israel, including a barrage aimed at Jerusalem on 15 December. The delivery of humanitarian aid in the Strip continues to face nearly insurmountable challenges. Amid displacement of an unimaginable scale and active hostilities, the humanitarian response system is on the brink. Limited steps by Israel, including allowing entry of more fuel, food and cooking gas, and opening Kerem Shalom, Karem Abu Salem crossing for the entry of humanitarian supplies, are positive, but fall short of what is needed to address the human catastrophe on the ground. In the northern part of the Strip, that remains mostly inaccessible to humanitarian actors due to insecurity, as well as access restrictions imposed by Israel. Mr. President, in our focus on Gaza, let us not forget that our attention during the first 9 months of this year was on a West Bank in crisis, with mounting pressures for settlement activity, which I note more than doubled to reach a new annual record since 2017, settler violence, increased Palestinian armed attacks, Israeli security forces operation, a rapidly deteriorating fiscal and economic situation, and the Palestinian Authority struggling to face these challenges. Most of these trends have continued and intensified. On 8 December, Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinians, including a 14-year-old child, in a local commander in the Fatah-affiliated Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades during operations in Al-Fara'a refugee camp, which led to exchanges of fire with armed Palestinians. Over 12 to 14 and 16 to 17 December, 2 large-scale Israeli operations took place in Jenin refugee camp and in Tulkarem, respectively. The operations included exchange of fire with armed Palestinians, Israeli drone strikes, and search operations. In Tulkarem, There were extensive infrastructure damage from IDF bulldozers. 17 Palestinians were killed and dozens were arrested. The Palestinian Authority's fiscal situation continued to be extremely precarious amidst broader economic concerns across the West Bank. Some 150,000 Palestinian workers have been unable to reach their jobs since Israeli imposed strict entry restrictions following the 7 October attacks. Mr. President, I remain concerned about the wider impact of the war in Gaza and the risk for escalation in the region. Daily exchanges of fire across the blue line have continued with the risk of miscalculation and escalation, posing a grave threat to regional stability. It is imperative that Lebanon not be dragged into regional conflagration and that the parties return to cessation of hostilities under the framework of Resolution 1701. Meanwhile, in the Red Sea, the Houthis in Yemen have targeted numerous vessels by boarding parties as well as by armed drones and missiles. Strikes have damaged a number of ships and other interdicted by US and other naval forces in the area, raising concerns over the safety of shipping through the vital trade artery. 4 major shipping companies have reportedly directed their vessel not to transit through the Red Sea, while Israel's Eilat port has reported an provision of Security Council Resolution 2334 during the reporting period. The violence that has taken place since 7 October in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in and around Gaza, has shaken the region and most tragically the lives of millions of Palestinians and Israelis. The violence has taken, I strongly condemn the abhorrent armed attacks by Hamas and others in Israel. Nothing can justify the acts of terror that were committed and the deliberate killing, maiming, and abduction of civilians and other protected persons. Accounts of the attacks reveal acts of brutality that are impossible to accept and comprehend. I am appalled by the report of sexual violence during the attacks. These must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted. The indiscriminate firing of rockets towards the Israeli population center, which continue to this day, is a violation of international humanitarian law and must cease completely. I welcome the release of 110 Israeli and foreign hostages and reiterate that all remaining hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2712. The magnitude of hostilities between Israel and Hamas and the scope of death and destruction in Gaza have been unprecedented and unbearable to witness. I unequivocally condemn the killing of civilians in Gaza, including women and children. I mourn the loss of every civilian, including 131 UN colleagues, the single largest loss of life in the history of the organization. I remain gravely concerned by the impact of the ongoing hostilities on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The current conditions are making it impossible for meaningful humanitarian operations to be conducted. I'm also deeply concerned by escalating tensions in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Intensified armed exchanges between Palestinians and Israeli security forces, predominantly in the context of Israeli operations, have led to exceedingly high levels of fatalities and arrests. I reiterate that security forces must exercise maximum restraints and use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. I am alarmed by the lethal attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians and by Palestinians against the Israelis in the occupied West Bank and Israel. All perpetrators of violence must be held accountable and swiftly brought to justice. I am appalled by the numerous instances of officials glorifying violence, encouraging the killing of civilians. Such rhetoric is abhorrent and must be clearly rejected by leaders on all sides. Leaders have an obligation to clearly and explicitly condemn acts of terror and violence directed against civilians. I remain deeply troubled by the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that is impeding access to Palestinians to their land and resources and threatening the viability of a future independent Palestinian state. I reiterate that Israeli settlements constitute a flagrant violation of UN resolutions and international law and call on the government of Israel to cease the advancement of all settlement activity immediately. Mr. President, this war has once again served as a devastating and tragic reminder that there is no substitute for a legitimate political process that will resolve the core issues driving the conflict. It is critical that this important junction to enable the parties to re-engage on the long-delayed political path to a two-state solution. I urge Israelis, Palestinians, the states of the region and the broader international community to work together towards this goal. The UN efforts to support this objective has already begun through active consultations in the region. Our work must continue. The UN remains committed to supporting Palestinians and Israelis in ending the occupation and resolving the conflict in line with international law, relevant UN resolutions and bilateral agreements in pursuit of the two-state, Israel, and an independent, democratic, viable and sovereign Palestinian state, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security with its secure and recognized border, on the basis of the 1967 lines with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Tor Vennesland for his briefing. I now give the floor to Major General Patrick Gauchat.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council. I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the Council, sharing the perspective of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, UNTSO, on the situation in the Middle East. Mr. President, the events of Saturday, 7 October surprised, shocked, and appealed everyone, and the conflict they have triggered continued to reverberate in the region. Since UNTSO does not have a person presence and around Gaza or southern Israel, UNTSO personnel were not in a position to observe directly the events of the 7 October or developments since. But those events have assuredly impacted our operations and regional dynamics. Mr. President, the history of UNTSO goes back 75 years. On May 29, 1948, this Council called for cessation of hostilities in Palestine under Resolution 50. This truce was to be supervised by a UN mediator assisted by a group of military observers that would become known as United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, the first peacekeeping mission in the history of United Nations. In 1949, with the signing of 4 armistice agreements, one between Israel and each of its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and the Syrian Arab Republic, the Council declared the role of the mediator complete and transferred the role of supervising the implementation of the armistice agreement to the Chief of Staff, UNTSO. In addition, UNTSO was also tasked with assisting the parties in their application and observance until the peaceful adjustment of the future situation of Palestine. That two-part mandate remains the basis for UNTSO's presence to this day and is accomplished through 1, deploying expert military observers to maintain unconditional ceasefires, and 2, maintaining a strong regional liaison with host nations. Mr. President, on the operational level, from 8 October, many ceasefire violations have occurred across the blue line between Israel and Lebanon, and then on the Golan between Israel and the Syrian Arab Republic. UNTSO's military observer, who constitute Observe Group Lebanon, OGL, and Observe Group Golan, OGG, under the operational control of the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, and the UN Disengagement Observer Force UNDOF, respectively, took appropriate and adapted security measures. They continue to fulfill the critical role of assuring accurate military reporting, accurate military observation, investigation of ceasefire violations, inspection on the Golan. And these reportings enable liaison with the parties, including for the purpose of de-escalating tensions. During the last few weeks, the adaptations were mainly logistic, security, rotation, and deployment of personnel. Since 8 October, the military crossing points, which UNTSO uses between Israel and Lebanon, as well as between the Israeli-occupied Golan and the Syrian-controlled Golan, has been closed. Similarly, the access points to the closed observation post, located just after the IDF technical fence on the Golan, were sealed, impeding the rotations and the logistical support. Through good dialogue with the parties, UNTSO was able to put in place the minimum required support and security for the deployed military observer. In southern Lebanon, where a very clear escalatory pattern is observed, UNTSO military observer in OGL still conduct blue line patrols every day, taking calculated risks. As part of the wider work conducted by UNIFIL, this international presence influences restraint by the parties in their kinetic activities. Our female military observers are key in connecting with local women and children across the area where UNTSO is deployed, noting our exemplary percentage of female officers, 22% in the mission. The everyday liaison function of UNTSO military observers include engaging with local population, local leaders, and military commanders. I want here to add that their presence during the current tensions in South Lebanon is reassuring for the local population. Mr. President, in parallel with the work of the military observers on the ceasefire lines, UNTSO maintains liaison offices in Cairo, Beirut, and Damascus, as well as in Jerusalem for Jordan and Israel. UNTSO regional liaison mandate allows the mission to analyze and address complex issues, especially those not covered by other missions operating in the region, whether peacekeeping or SPMs. It also allows us to be in direct contact with the 5 parties. And I want to stress a very good contact with all 5 parties, passing messages and establishing tactical confidence building measures. I have done that numerous times since 7 of October. In each of the capitals of the 5 hosting countries of UNTSO that I have visited, authorities have shared their view on the regional situation as well as on the ceasefires in which UNTSO is involved through OGL and OGG. For instance, on the Blue Line area, officials of both Israel and Lebanon communicated to me their willingness to improve security and implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1701. On the Golan, both Israel and Syria mentioned to me their very strong will to keep the armistice in place, and they also shared their concerns and their expectation of the peacekeeping system. On this basis, I shared, of course, these messages with the parties and my relevant UN colleagues, as this contributes to the overall effort of the United Nations for peace in the region. During these exchanges, I systematically try to diffuse potentially dangerous situations, clarify positions, and ensure my interlocutors that I would pass their messages. This was always well received by the parties. Mr. President, in conclusion, UNTSO continues to perform its regional mandate. You can rest assured that UNTSO is a vibrant mission of women and men, national and international, military and civilian, true to the concept of unarmed military observer mission, operating with the consent of the 5 countries and parties. As the regional situation evolves, we will continue to contribute towards the comprehensive, just and peaceful resolution of the situation in the Middle East, consistent with the mandates given by this Council. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Major General Gauchat for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Special Coordinator Venzlin and Head of Mission Gauchat, for your briefing. Colleagues, over the last few days and weeks, we have shared many of our thoughts on the subject, and we will have more to say later in the day. But right now, a few things bear reiterating. That the atrocities Hamas committed on October 7 must be condemned. That we must pursue justice for the victims of horrific sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on and after that day. That Israelis still face barrages of rocket fire to this day, rocket fire launched by Hamas from civilian infrastructure in Gaza at civilians in Israel. That civilians must be protected, and that humanitarian aid must reach those who desperately need it. That Hamas must not be allowed to control Gaza for the sake of Israeli and Palestinian safety alike, and that Israel has the right to protect its people from terrorism. That regional actors, including the Houthis, must not exploit and widen this conflict. That UNRWA must be supported, and the United States has provided more than $422 million to its 2023 appeals to that end. And that ultimately, we must all work towards a two-state solution, which serves as the only foundation for a truly sustainable peace. Of course, as Special Coordinator Venzlin highlighted, the events that have unfolded in the West Bank over the last year have moved us farther away from that reality. That includes the ongoing construction of settlements in the West Bank, which undermines the possibility of a Palestinian state. And it includes a sharp and alarming uptick in settler violence, especially because even before Hamas's attack on October 7, 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since 2005. Colleagues, the United States condemns these violent attacks, period. We believe the perpetrators must be held accountable. As Secretary Blinken announced earlier this month, we will continue to issue visa bans to extremist individuals who have undermined peace, security, and stability in the West Bank. Already, we have implemented this policy for dozens of individuals and their families under this policy. And we have repeatedly underscored to the Israeli government that it, too, must do more to investigate this violence and hold extremist settlers who have committed it responsible. More than that, Israeli officials must not fan the flames of this violence with incendiary, dehumanizing rhetoric, because we have seen the ways in which words have consequences, not only in the West Bank, but around the world. Over the past 2 months, we have witnessed a spike in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, both online and in our communities, including in our own backyard here in New York City, where just a few blocks north, a halal food vendor faced vile, bigoted harassment. Where just over the river in Brooklyn, a Jewish man was brutally beaten in front of his family's home. Rhetoric matters, and we must do more to prevent this dangerous dehumanization. There are 2 more subjects I want to address today. The first is what faces those reporting in the region. Because today, journalists are not just witnessing what is happening, they are experiencing it, all of it. Scores have lost family members, like Al Jazeera's Wael Daoud, who was himself injured last week. Others have been displaced from their homes or gravely injured on the job. And far, far too many have been killed, making this the deadliest period in memory for journalists. Colleagues, there are few callings more noble than telling the truth. Journalists' words change hearts and minds and move people to action. And in this moment, more must be done to protect them. Colleagues, the final note I want to end on is about the hostages. Earlier this week, our mission met with young Israelis whose loved ones are still being held captive in Gaza. They came to us to share the stories of their loved ones, and we promised that we would tell those stories to this council, to the world. We heard from Amit and Mikal Levy, whose sister, Nahama, was kidnapped by Hamas. So many of us have seen the video of her being forced into a jeep at gunpoint, her hands tied and her pants bloodied. But what so many of us don't know is Nahama's story, the fact that she was a peace activist who built connections with Palestinians in an effort to chart a brighter future, who dreamed of being a diplomat, and maybe even sitting in this very chamber, whose smile is missed every single day. We will continue to share Nahama's story and every hostage's story until they are home, until Amit and Mikhail can embrace their sister once again. Colleagues, we must hold space for the heartbreak on all sides, for all whose lives have been disrupted and destroyed by a conflict that Hamas set in motion, that Hamas restarted after a week-long humanitarian pause, and that Hamas could once again end by simply releasing the hostages. For all those who have suffered in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and around the globe, let us work in good faith to end this cycle of violence and sow the seeds for a lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Special Coordinator Venezueland, for your updates. And I thank Major General Gosha for sharing UNTSO's valuable activities. Japan expresses its grave concern over the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Following the resumption of fighting after the breakdown of the humanitarian pause, airstrikes and ground operations, especially in the southern Gaza Strip, have led to a significant number of civilian casualties. The total death toll in Gaza is approaching 20,000. Two-thirds of the victims are reportedly women and children. This must stop. UNRWA facilities are overcrowded, with displaced Palestinians. Hunger is alarmingly on the rise, and communicable diseases are rapidly spreading. As UNRWA's Commissioner General Lazzarini put it, everywhere you go, people are desperate, hungry, and terrified. It is critically important that Israel abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, in order to prevent harm to innocent civilians and basic civilian infrastructure. Japan also calls for all parties to act faithfully based on UN Security Council Resolution 2712. The amount of assistance crossing through Rafah is the amount of assistance crossing through Rafah is nowhere near enough. We note that the border crossing at Kerem Shalom is finally open for direct delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. This will be a crucial lifeline to many, but as we heard from Special Coordinator, it is still too short for the needed. Mr. President, beyond Gaza, there remains a serious risk of regional spillover. Continued clashes on Israel's northern border could easily escalate with a single miscalculation. Missile launches and attacks on vessels by the Houthis are causing a considerable interruption to global shipping and threaten maritime security in the region. Of particular concern is the Galaxy Leader, which is a ship operated by the Japanese company that was seized and has been held along with its multinational crew by the Houthis for nearly a month. We strongly urge the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release both the crew and the ship. Mr. President, meanwhile, in the West Bank, we observe with concern spiking settler violence and attacks on Israelis by Palestinians, which are inflaming the situation. Japan also calls once again on Israel to refrain from advancing settlement activities, which are a clear violation of international law and against relevant Security Council resolution. In conclusion, the international community must exert all its efforts to urgently alleviate the suffering in Gaza and end this tragedy. We can no longer ignore the root causes of the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel and an independent Palestinian state must live side by side in peace and security. We must heed the calls of voices around the world who wish to see these aspirations realized fully and decisively. There is simply no alternative. Now it's high time to act. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Coordinator Winsland and General Gauchat for their briefings. Brazil deeply regrets that Resolution 2334 continues to be disregarded, a fact that only aggravates the negative trends imperiling the two-state solution. Regrettably, that is the case of almost every single resolution passed by this Council regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not to mention those that were simply vetoed. As the world watches the appalling human toll of the ongoing war in Gaza with astonishment and powerlessness, settlement activities in contravention of international law have continued and expanded, relentlessly and undisturbed, throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, in flagrant violation of international law and in defiance to the authority of this Council. We are deeply concerned by the increase in the displacement of Palestinians from their homes as a result of settlement activities, which only worsened after the 7th October terrorist attacks against Israel, as well as by the intensification of settler violence in the West Bank. State violence has been on the rise not just in Gaza. Demolitions, eviction orders, and other types of attacks against Palestinians and their households have further expanded in Palestinian land, including East Jerusalem. The latest Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 reminds us of the gravity of the situation, including the staggering numbers of victims and the amount of destruction caused by the war. Unprecedented levels of violence and destruction in a region already marked by serious instability have, in the latest reporting period, produced the deadliest record for both Israelis and Palestinians in the history of this 75-year-old conflict. UN officials, including the Secretary General, have also warned us about the imminent collapse of the humanitarian system in Gaza, prompted by military operations imperiling the safety of humanitarian workers and by decisions to limit the inflow of humanitarian aid to those in need. Our failure in responding to their call for help through a ceasefire and the scaling up of humanitarian aid has contributed to further loss of innocent lives. Mr. President, with its slow action, the Council has been condoning this never-ending cycle of violence and lawlessness for far too long. Our inability not just to pass meaningful resolutions, but also to enforce decisions already adopted, has created the impression that in the Middle East, the only law that matters is the law of the strongest. This state of affairs is not in the interest of anyone. On the contrary, it only breeds further violence and resentment. It also encourages contempt for the law and disbelief in the ability of the international community to deliver on its promise of and on its commitment to a two-state solution with Israel and a viable state of Palestine living side by side in peace and security within mutually agreed and internationally recognized borders. Our collective duty to advance durable peace in the Middle East requires from us now that we ensure respect for international law by all parties to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the protection of civilians, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and the delivery of humanitarian aid. In the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole, through justice, accountability and reconciliation, including by putting an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 and the respect of all pertinent Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
President. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking the Special Coordinator to Venezuela and Major Patrick Gosha for their participation in this meeting. We welcome their efforts and thank them for the efforts to ensure respect for international humanitarian and human rights law and to liaise with all regional actors to avoid regional escalation. As the Secretary General's latest reports point out, Resolution 2334 of the Security Council condemns, and I quote, all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation, incitement, and destruction. And in this spirit, Switzerland condemns the act of terror committed by Hamas on the 7th of October and has since called for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. In his report, the Secretary General also strongly condemns these acts of terror, including the taking of hostages and the sexual violence committed during the attacks by Hamas. Since then, thousands of civilians have tragically lost their lives in Israel and many more throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. The risk of the conflict becoming regional remains real, as is shown by the growing tensions on both sides of the blue line. The situation in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem also shows this. The number of deaths amongst civilians there was already reaching frightening record highs before the 7th of October. Since then, violence has increased, and according to the UN, more than 250 Palestinians, a quarter of them children, have been killed. More than two-thirds of them died during Israeli operations, including airstrikes and incursions, particularly in the Tulkarem, Jenin, and Balata camps. Switzerland calls on Israel to respect its obligations under international law during such operations. In particular, the use of force must meet the criteria of necessity and proportionality and protect every individual's right to life and security of person. We also condemn the violent acts committed by settlers against Palestinian civilians, which reinforce the coercive environment prevailing in the West Bank. This has led to the deaths of several Palestinians, the forced displacement of more than 1,000 civilians, and the destruction of essential infrastructure since the 7th of October. The escalation of this violence is unacceptable. Switzerland recalls Israel's obligations under international law, including the obligation to protect the civilian population. In an environment of near complete immunity, independent investigations must be carried out into all violations of international law in order to bring the perpetrators to justice. In addition, Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory are illegal under international humanitarian law, as mentioned in Resolution 2334. As the occupying power, Israel must refrain from taking any measures that would introduce permanent changes into the Palestinian territory. Mr. President, in Gaza today, the protection of civilians is not being respected. Aid remains insufficient. It must be increased. Its relevance must be ensured. And above all, the conditions must be created for its effective distribution throughout the Gaza Strip. We welcome the opening of Kerem Shalom and expect it to allow the entry of humanitarian and commercial goods via a variety of access routes. In view of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, with a real risk of a collapse of this social order, we hope that this Council will be able to shoulder its responsibility and speak out in support of the Gazan civilian population in need. While we recognize Israel's right to ensure its defense and security, we call on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law, in particular to fulfill their obligations in the conduct of hostilities, and in particular to respect the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution in all circumstances. We must support any process that promotes peace and security. The full, equal, and meaningful participation of Palestinian and Israeli women is essential. The two-state solution is the only foundation for peace and stability in the region. We must help to rebuild this foundation for two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mozambique commends Ecuador's presidency for convening this briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our sincere gratitude to the briefers, Mr. Tor Wennesland, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Major General Patrick Gauchin, Head of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, for the insightful briefing on the Middle East peace and process. Mr. President, Mozambique, along with other members of the Council, has voiced grave concern regarding the situation in the Palestinian occupied territory. Specifically, we highlighted several critical issues such as the expansion of settlements, violence against the civilians, inflammatory language, and other provocations between the parties. All these activities are flagrant violations under the international law and contribute to aggravate the tensions as well as an obstacle to the peace in the region. It is crucial for all parties involved to exercise maximum restraint, prioritize dialogue, and work towards de-escalating tensions. The international community must continue to advocate for a just and peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The ongoing conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups has exacerbated the situation, leaving thousands of people in desperate need. Acknowledging the situation on the ground, Mozambique appreciates the tireless efforts of all stakeholders and the international community to advance the peace process. We therefore welcome several initiatives, including the high-level meetings hosted by Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, United States of America, Muslim and Arab leaders, Organization of Islamic States, League of Arab States, among others, to address the current crisis. Mr. President, equally important is a demonstration of goodwill by both parties, and in this vein, the immediate release of hostages is of paramount importance. Let us collectively work towards a humanitarian pause and de-escalation of the conflict to safeguard lives and uphold human dignity. Given the dire situation, we call for immediate implementation of Resolution 2712 to ensure the timely delivery of vital goods and services for civilians' well-being and protection, especially children and women. There is an urgent need to scale up and improve humanitarian access into Gaza. Lives are at stake, and we have a duty to help the most vulnerable, including children and women. We believe that only an immediate suspension of hostilities can allow for the safe and unhindered humanitarian access and the delivery of life-saving assistance to the desperate civilian population. Mozambique therefore fully supports the proposal for the UN Secretary General to establish a monitoring mechanism to confirm the humanitarian nature of aid consignments into Gaza. We believe that this will fast-track the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, Mozambique's stance on the Israel-Palestinian conflict is well known and emanates from its conviction that the two-state solution remains fundamental for achieving lasting peace and harmony in the region. This necessitates a common effort from both conflicting parties supported by the international community according to the Security Council resolutions 242 and 2334. We urge the parties to continue the constructive dialogue towards this goal while respecting the two-state principle. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. A humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding in Gaza, and the intense suffering of innocent Palestinian civilians shows no sign of abating. Israel is reckoning with the brutal horror of the 7 October attacks. More than 130 hostages continue to be held by Hamas, and just this morning I met with the parents of one girl still held hostage. I will carry their words with me for a long time. As my Prime Minister has said, we need a sustainable ceasefire that breaks the cycle of violence. Hamas must stop firing rockets into Israel. All hostages must be released, and aid must flow into Gaza. This is the only way to achieve a sustainable peace based on a two-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security. President, we are focused on 3 areas. First, too many civilians have been killed. Israel must be targeted and precise in its efforts to address the threat posed by Hamas, and should do more to discriminate sufficiently between terrorists and civilians. Civilian infrastructure must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. The Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have repeatedly delivered this message to Israel, and we will continue to do so. Second, we need to continue to work on increasing the amount of humanitarian support into Gaza through as many direct routes as possible. The agreement to open Kerem Shalom is welcome. We look forward to its urgent implementation. Israel should also immediately increase the range of humanitarian items allowed into Gaza. Third, as we heard today, in recent months, the violence of extremist settlers in the West Bank has dramatically increased. Since 7 October, there have been 8 Palestinians killed by Israeli settlers, including 1 child, and at least 1,257 displaced amid settler violence and access restrictions. We strongly condemn these hateful acts which undermine prospects for peace. We are banning those responsible for settler violence from entering the UK to make sure our country cannot be a home for people who commit these intimidating acts. Israel must also do more to hold perpetrators of settler violence to account and to end the demolition and confiscation of Palestinian property. And we reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and its lower aqueduct. We are clear, these settlements are illegal under international law, present an obstacle to peace, and threaten the physical viability and delivery of a two-state solution, which must become a reality to ensure justice and peace for Palestinians and Israelis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank Special Coordinator Winnes Land and Major General Gocha for their briefings that were just delivered. Nearly 80 days into the new outbreak of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, more than 2 million innocent people in Gaza have been suffering from unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. On the 11th of December, thanks to the arrangements made by the governments of the UAE and Egypt, I visited the Al Arish and Rafah crossings together with the ambassadors of a number of council members and gained a hands-on experience of the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Egypt and other countries have made tremendous efforts to alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground, but they still face many difficulties. On the one hand, the people of Gaza have no access to water, electricity, food, fuel, medicine. They simply lack the minimum supplies for survival. On the other hand, a large number of trucks delivering supplies are waiting in line, while the supplies piled up at the warehouses in Al Arish cannot be delivered in time to the people in need. What is even more worrying is that, due to Israel's indiscriminate bombardment, the humanitarian relief network, comprising a number of UN agencies operating in Gaza, is on the verge of paralysis, and the safety and security of their personnel cannot be guaranteed. In this context, the UAE, on behalf of the Arab states, has tabled the draft text of a new council resolution aimed at removing bottlenecks to humanitarian access and alleviating the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. The UAE has held extensive consultations with council members on the draft text and has listened to the views and opinions of UN humanitarian agencies and has gained the support of the majority of council members. China has joined in the co-sponsorship of the draft resolution. We believe that no country should be hesitant out of any reason regarding this draft resolution. We urge relevant council members to take a constructive approach and support the council in taking meaningful, life-saving, and immediate actions. It should be noted that the UAE's draft resolution is an emergency initiative to address the immediate urgent needs arising from the current humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Facing the prolonged Gaza conflict and the escalations in the West Bank, the Council must further play its due role and take action for realizing a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and early date, for restoring regional peace, and for upholding fairness and justice. First, the realization of a ceasefire remains the overriding prerequisite. Only a ceasefire can prevent greater civilian casualties, including those of hostages. Only a ceasefire can prevent the regional conflict from spiraling out of control, and only a ceasefire can prevent the prospects of a political solution from being completely killed. The international community has repeatedly and overwhelmingly called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, yet Israel continues its bombing and shelling. Schools, hospitals, mosques, Christian churches, and refugee camps have been repeatedly targeted in military operations, and there can be no justification for such attacks. It must be pointed out that causing more civilian casualties in Gaza will not hold the solution for rescuing the hostages, nor will it lead to greater security for any party. We urge Israel to immediately reverse its course of action and stop its indiscriminate military attacks and collective punishment against the people of Gaza. Second, every effort must be made to prevent the West Bank situation from getting out of control. While the eyes of the international community are focused on Gaza, violence committed by the Israeli army and settlers in the West Bank has intensified. Searches, arrests, and attacks against Palestinians happen on a daily basis with appalling frequency and intensity, and have resulted in a large number of Palestinian casualties. Settlement of activities violate international law and Council Resolution 2334 and continue to erode the foundation of the two-state solution. We urge Israel as the occupying power to comply with its obligations under international law, cease all settlement activities, and effectively curb settler violence so as to put an end to impunity. Third, the two-state solution must be revitalized with maximum political determination. The two-state solution is the only way out for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It is also the broad consensus of the international community. The main reason that the Israeli-Palestinian issue has long failed to be resolved is precisely because the two-state solution has not been implemented. We are extremely concerned about the recent public rejection of the two-state solution by some political leaders. China calls for greater international and regional diplomatic efforts to reaffirm the commitment to the two-state solution, revitalize the political prospects of the two-state solution, and restart direct negotiations between Palestine and Israel. Undoubtedly, any solution to the question of Palestine should respect the will of the Palestinian people and the legitimate concerns of the countries of the region, and should not deviate from the basic direction of the two-state solution. China calls for the convening of an international peace conference that is larger in scale, scope, and effects, and for the formulation of a timetable and a roadmap so that the two-state solution can truly be realized. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. I also thank Major General Patrick Gaushev for his briefing. Since the Council's last meeting on this resolution in September, the situation has deteriorated on all fronts. We have witnessed an unprecedented scale of death and destruction in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Israel, the consequences of which will no doubt reverberate for years to come. This year, the intensification of deadly violence against civilians in the region, including acts of terror, has skyrocketed. This unyielding cycle of violence has pushed us further away from a political horizon than in any point in recent history. It is painfully clear that the conflict in Gaza is taking an unimaginable toll on the population. A shocking number of civilians have been killed and displaced. Countless others continue to face the denial of basic necessities. Malta stresses that respect for international humanitarian law is paramount. All parties are obliged to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are protected. A significant scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza is desperately needed, including through the opening of further crossing points. This must happen in tandem with assurances for the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, including of their premises. The rising death toll of humanitarian and UNRWA staff is completely unacceptable, and attacks on religious sites and persons seeking refuge within are also unacceptable, as is the number of journalists that have been killed in this conflict. Malta stresses that an immediate humanitarian ceasefire is now an imperative to ensure the necessary protection of civilians and de-escalate this conflict. We continue to strongly condemn the unjustifiable Hamas terror attack of 7th October. Indiscriminate rocket fire and acts of sexual violence are equally condemnable. We reiterate our calls on Hamas to release the remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally in accordance with Resolution 2712. We also underline the urgency for humanitarian actors to be allowed access to the remaining hostages as long as they are held captive. Too many women and children on both sides continue to unjustly suffer the consequences of this conflict. Children have been abducted and are being killed and maimed at staggering rates. Children face heightened risks of malnutrition, severe illness, dehydration, and psychological trauma. They deserve our undisputed protection. We commend UNICEF staff and their partners for providing life-saving aid and psychosocial support to all children, in particular inside Gaza, in extremely difficult circumstances. We also underline that attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian residents and properties in the West Bank are inexcusable. Such acts must not be allowed to take place with impunity. Settlements, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinians violate international law and Resolution 2334. They constitute an obstacle to peace, inflame tensions, and threaten the viability of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. We reiterate our strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and actions advancing settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. President, urgent steps must be taken to prevent regional escalation and to relaunch credible negotiations and engagement between both parties. A meaningful political horizon cannot be achieved unless we ensure that the Palestinian Authority has the fiscal stability and support it needs. Malta reaffirms its commitment to a just and comprehensive resolution of the conflict based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. It has never been more critical that the international community engages in meaningful, peace-forward efforts, placing regional stakeholders at the forefront of any deliberations and addressing the core issues of this conflict. We cannot return to an unsustainable status quo. The violence and suffering must stop. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Tor Venesland, and the head of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization mission, Mr. Gosha. We thank them for the overview of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, where for 2.5 months we have been witnessing an unprecedented in the number of victims massacre. Since the last meeting on the Council on this issue on the 8th of December, 10 days have elapsed, and the number of its victims in this time has grown further. To date, since the beginning of the Israeli military operation in Gaza, about 19,000 people lost their lives. 70% of them are women and children. 90% of the Gaza population, about 2 million people, have become internally displaced. The victims of indiscriminate Israeli actions is also amongst Israeli hostages. Add to that the total blockade of Gaza, including downed comms, harsh restrictions on humanitarian aid supplies. There is an acute shortage in the strip of water, fuel, medicines, and the civic order, and on the brink of collapse. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom confirms that no one is safe in Gaza. Out of 36 medical facilities, until recently, only 8 functioned partially, but they didn't have water or electricity. There is an illustration also here through the number of staff killed. The ICRC and UN staff were killed together with their families, including babies. Under attack, including repeated attack, are about 90 UN facilities. 133 staff of the organization were killed. And this, according to the UN data, is the largest single loss the U.S. has ever suffered. The head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, said the disaster in the enclave in the strip is the worst he's ever seen, especially taking into account that people have nowhere to go, and the stated goal of eliminating Hamas cannot be implemented. According to mass media, Israel dropped about 29,000 air bombs on Gaza, which is comparable to the number dropped by the U.S. and UK throughout their entire military aggression in Iraq in 2003. We have received shocking news from the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem on the 16th of December during the Holy Family festivities in church, which was a refuge for many families. An Israeli sniper killed 2 Christians. 7 more people were wounded as they tried to protect their loved ones. According to witness account, there were no warnings issued to that. On the same day, Israel had an airstrike against the monastery of Mother Teresa, which was marked as a shelter since the beginning of the escalation. And such attacks continue at the time when everyone is preparing for the Christmas celebrations on the 25th of December. Mr. President, against the background of disaster in Gaza, what we have somewhat in the background in the news is what is happening in the West Bank, whereas violence rages there as well. There are continued armed raids by Israel and brutal attacks by Israeli settlers. As a result of an Israeli incursion into Nur Shams camp, 5 Palestinians were killed in the last 24 hours, and the day before, another Palestinian was killed in the Farah camp. Therefore, since the 7th of October, the overall number of victims of the so-called Israeli operations in the West Bank is at least 293 people. And in this context, we'd like to underscore the fact that the clearing of the West Bank is something that Israel has been doing for a long time, even before 7th October. And then there was no link with terror threats or security issues, which is a slogan that the West of Jerusalem is using for its unprecedented in scope operation in Gaza. In parallel to that, in the West Bank, there's a demolition of Palestinian houses without construction permits, and it's virtually impossible to receive such a permit. There is also continued settlement policy prosecuted by the Western Jerusalem, including funding for the expanded settlements. Such plans are being approved by the Israeli authorities in parallel with the planned destruction of Gaza. Mr. President, the scope of humanitarian disaster in the area of conflict compelled the Secretary General to invoke his powers under Article 99 of the Charter and call on the Council to pass a decision on ending the bloodbath. But despite the efforts made by the absolute majority of Security Council members, all of the drafts submitted were blocked by Washington. Washington, instead of helping civilians, is providing Israel massively with all kinds of weapons which are used to kill Palestinian civilians. Currently, everyone should understand that the stalling of collective UN efforts is not a result of some kind of objective institutional issues, but rather as a result of stubborn and egotistical ambitions on the part of American leadership. It will not be an exaggeration to say that there is a consensus in the world about the need to have an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. And the only state besides Israel which stands against this, pitting themselves against the entire international community, is the United States. After the tragic events on the 7th of October, the policy of Washington in the region has reached a strategic impasse. The Hamas raid, for which there is no and cannot be a justification, cannot be considered separately for what Israel is doing to construct and expand settlements on Palestinian territories, or separate from the failed policy by the U.S. aimed at ignoring the Palestinian issue, ignoring the aspirations for their own state, and their work to undermine the international basis for the Middle East settlement, including the two-state solution. With Washington's assist, the UN resolutions pledging a state for the Palestinians are being stonewalled by Israel for more than a decade against a background of illegal expansion of settlements and seizing of Palestinians' land and property. This is a background, also the blockade of Gaza, and against this background, we have several generations of Gazans grown up against that. Our position has been consistent. We cherish our historically close relationship with the Palestinians and Israelis alike. We condemned any kind of act of terror or indiscriminate use of force against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We advocate the end of hostilities in Gaza, ensuring the safety of civilians and the release of those detained. At the same time, we're consistent in our advocacy for the creation of an independent and viable Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Our approach is based on the international legal basis for the Middle East settlement, including the resolutions passed by the General Assembly and Security Council. Furthermore, we call for the implementation of the only to-date product that Security Council has on Gaza, Resolution 2712, which, as weak as it is, at least contains a mandatory for implementation appeals to parties to establish humanitarian pauses. There has to be an international monitoring of the implementation of this Security Council decision on the UN aegis. We're grateful to Secretary General for working through the options for this monitoring. We are studying them very closely, and we expect that the Council in the very near future will decide on the option to choose and will pass a decision on that in a resolution. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante de la Federación.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank Special Coordinator Mr. Tor Winnisland and Major General Patrick Bouchard for their briefing. We welcome the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, which addresses some of the crucial issues surrounding the Middle East peace process. We regret that the prospect for our collective aspiration for the two-state solution continues to be obscured by the current highly degenerative environment in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the briefings we have just received paint a gloomy picture as far as the two-state solution is concerned. We know that actions on the ground by both Israelis and Palestinians are counterproductive to the search for a lasting peace in the Middle East. We reiterate our position that violence has never been successful as a tool for the resolution of any conflict and will not be in the ongoing conflict. We are equally distressed about the appalling humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, which seems to deteriorate on a daily basis as the war lingers on. We call for the respect of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the protection of all civilians and civilian infrastructure. We, however, welcome the gesture by the Israeli government to open its border crossing at Kerem Shalom for direct delivery of humanitarian assistance and supplies to the ever-increasing number of internally displaced people in Gaza, including women, children, and the elderly who desperately need them. Mr. President, as a council, we must do everything within our means to bring the hostilities to an end and give peace a chance. We must also recognize and accept the importance of resuming the stalled peace process. It is our firm belief that the resumption of the peace process will promote confidence-building measures and provide for a peaceful and lasting resolution of the question of Palestine, based on the principles of international law and relevant UN resolutions. In closing, I wish to reiterate Ghana's commitment to continue supporting a meaningful peace process, which would eventually provide the potential pathways towards resolving the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict and ensuring the fulfillment of the rights and aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians for the prosperity of the peoples of the wider Middle East region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Tor Wennesland and General Gaucha for their briefings. President, the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza should not lead us to forget that Israeli settlement building is continuing and even accelerating in the West Bank. France reiterates its strong condemnation of this illegal policy under international law. It contravenes several resolutions of this Council, notably 2334. We remind Israel of its obligations under its settlements. We reiterate our condemnation of the Israeli decision on the 6th of December to authorize the building of 1,800 new houses in settlements in East Jerusalem. We also strongly condemn the measures of expulsion notified to some families on the 10th of December in the Old City of Jerusalem. These decisions compromise the possibility of establishing a viable and contiguous Palestinian state, and they jeopardize the prospects for a two-state solution, with both having Jerusalem as its capital. Today's priority is to immediately curb these unilateral measures, and France recalls that Resolution 2334 also relates to the implementation of differentiation by states between the territory of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. In line with its obligations, the EU will ensure its strict implementation. We condemn the violence committed by extremist settlers in the West Bank, which terrorizes the Palestinian communities. This must immediately cease, and the perpetrators must be brought to book. Israel's inability to protect Palestinians and to prosecute these extremist settlers has led to an environment of impunity, total impunity, in which violence committed by settlers has reached unprecedented highs. This situation compromises the security in the West Bank and in the region and threatens prospects for a sustainable peace. On the 15th of December, France, with the UK, Switzerland, and 11 other states recalled Israel's obligation as the occupying power to protect Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. And we call on the Israeli authorities to bring the perpetrators of violence to justice. We cannot accept these abuses which deprive Palestinians of their rights and their land. This is what the French minister said in her visit to the region on the weekend, and she said that measures will be taken. President, we must urgently restore the prospects for a political solution to implement the two-state solution. The France Foreign Affairs Minister reaffirmed France's solidarity with the people of Israel and our commitments to Israel's security. I recall our strongest possible condemnation of the sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. We call for a new, immediate, lasting humanitarian truce, which must lead to a lasting ceasefire to obtain the liberation of the hostages detained by Hamas and to provide the people of Gaza with the aid that they urgently need. We recall the urgent need for all parties to fully comply with international humanitarian law. France deplores the deaths of thousands of Palestinian civilians, and we condemn the bombing of a building that led to the death of an agent of the Foreign Affairs Minister and many other civilians in Rafah. The Israeli authorities must urgently look into the circumstances of that bombing. President, the political process must urgently resume. We must work seriously towards building a state for the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority has a key role to play in this process, in the West Bank and in Gaza, which should be part of this Palestinian state. France is actively mobilized in this regard with the parties and with our regional and international partners. Inertia is not a solution because we have seen that the conflict in Gaza has already had repercussions in the wider region. We must urgently avoid a regional escalation, as the minister recalled in a visit to Lebanon yesterday. France calls on all parties to show responsibility. The stability of southern Lebanon needs the full in respect of Resolution 1701 by all parties. We also will continue to mobilize to ensure that there is freedom of navigation of the region as well. We welcome the Security Council's unanimity on that point. Thank you. I thank the representative of France for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're grateful to the Special Coordinator, Mr. Tor Vandersland, and to Major General Patrick Gauchin for their overview of the situation in Gaza and the region. There are far too many killed and wounded, lives destroyed in the name of the war, which cannot be won by violence. The war against Israel and Hamas since the 7th of October, a new phase in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is several decades old, seems to be the deadliest one for both parties, and this bloodbath must stop. We call on the Israeli authorities to exercise the greatest possible restraint and to act responsibly in the conduct of their military operations, and to do so in line with international humanitarian law. We also demand the immediate release, unconditionally, of all the hostages. Mr. President, the situation is worsening in an unprecedented way on the ground, and at the same time, the division within the Council is incomprehensible from the humanitarian viewpoint. On the 12th of December, the General Assembly passed with a large majority a resolution on immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. We voted in favor of this resolution. The cessation of hostility is a prerequisite for secure delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians. Similarly, parties are encouraged to have a constructive dialogue to reactivate a peace process so as to peacefully settle the conflict. The unity of Security Council is crucial if we want to save lives and discharge the obligations we have under international humanitarian law. We have supported and will support any initiative which will give us hope of saving human lives and contributing to improve the fate of civilians and to de-escalation. A draft resolution on the increase and follow-up of assistance to Gaza, which we hope to adopt today, provides us with an opportunity to do the following, inter alia: to reaffirm that the Gaza Strip is an integral part of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, and it has to be part of the Palestinian state. The call for the urgent and lasting cessation of hostilities so as to allow humanitarian access in an unimpeded way to Gaza. The demand for immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. The demand for the provision of fuel into Gaza at the level which is necessary to meet humanitarian needs. We support the proposal by the Secretary General to put together a monitoring mechanism for the humanitarian aid into Gaza. We take note also of the temporary opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing point. Mr. President, the hour is upon us. We cannot remain in this impasse. We are nearing the end of our mandate and will use what time is left to us to help silence the guns in the war between Israel and Hamas and make sure that the conflict doesn't spread to the region, because the risk of conflagration for the entire region is real. We are concerned by the attacks by the Houthis in Yemen against a vessel in the Red Sea, and the situation between Israel and Lebanon remains very volatile. We call on all parties to exercise restraint and to uphold the obligations they have under international humanitarian law. We also call for the implementation of Resolution 2712, which has given us so much hope in terms of saving human lives, in particular those of children and women. We will continue repeating that the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be a political and diplomatic one, and reached through dialogue and good faith negotiations, ensuring that the legitimate preoccupations of all parties are taken into account. We have to therefore intensify our efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict based on the two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank Special Coordinator Wanesland and General Gusha for their remarks. On October 7, innocent people were savagely murdered. Thousands were wounded. Babies, young people, and Holocaust survivors were killed. Women and girls were raped. Innocent people were taken hostage. What followed is known by all and continues to this hour. This war and its appalling human toll is a tragedy. Another one on top of so many seen in the past, where civilians always end up paying the high price, especially the children, victims of wars they never choose, of conflicts they cannot understand. We call for the full respect of the international humanitarian law, as we have done at every meeting, which is not an option, but an obligation. Terrorists must be killed, but innocent people, children, civilians and their families, humanitarian workers, UN staff and journalists must be protected. We deplore every innocent life lost in this bloody war, be it Israeli or Palestinian. Innocent life has the same value on any side of this or any border. Mr. President, for an entire week, guns were silenced, reason prevailed, and some 100 hostages were released with a glimpse of hope came back. The world was holding its breath, hoping for the truce to be extended, but Hamas did not see that way, leaving families of hostages in deep anguish, fully aware of what would happen, that more innocent people would be killed and more innocent Palestinians would be sacrificed. We remain worried about the situation of the hostages who are still in the bloody hands of Hamas. Those returned to Israel were malnourished, ill, injured, and in heavy psychological conditions. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release, and in the meantime, the ICRC must be allowed to visit and check their well-being. Colleagues, along the real war with guns, rockets, and tanks, another frontal clash is happening at the same time, one using tweets, hashtags, and shares, the so-called war with 140 characters, with unfiltered images, raw videos, with hate speech, complot theories, anti-Semitism, sowing more division, spreading more hatred. It would be a tragedy, or another one on top of the one in front of our eyes, that the immense suffering of the citizens of Gaza, the thousands of lives lost, this ocean of human pain on both sides be used by Hamas to strengthen their narrative. We are afraid that in this black and white context, this may be happening. It must be resisted because it is only a recipe for tragedy. Colleagues, we share the deep concern on the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Despite the amount of aid going through or the deconflicting mechanism in place, the fact is that the situation is very dire and a humanitarian system in pain is struggling to survive. We call for the full implementation of the Resolution 2712 and reiterate the need for urgent measures in order for the aid to reach the civilians as soon as possible and without any hindrance. We support efforts to scale up humanitarian aid and for the monitoring mechanism and all efforts to break up hostilities. We must make sure to put in place a mechanism that helps, facilitates, and makes it easy to reach those suffering, not rush into something that, despite the good intentions, may end up producing the opposite, especially for those on the ground. In this respect, we welcome the decision to open the Karim Shalom cross point for humanitarian aid. Mr. President, the situation in the West Bank is another area of concern. The settlers' violence on civilian Palestinians is unacceptable. It must end, and all cases should be properly investigated. We remain worried about the lack of implementation of Resolution 2334. We recall that settlements are in violation of international law. They constitute an obstacle to the two-state solution that they must be dismantled, not expanded. Mr. President, let me conclude with this. Like every other conflict, this one will also end, and we hope as soon as possible. It will leave behind ruins, immense grief, and deep scars. The political and physical reconstruction of Gaza will require new and true efforts. As this may be the last meeting for my country as member of the Council on this issue, just like we have said and repeated in every one of them, we look forward to the moment when the two-state solution is advanced, not like an empty mantra, not as an easy substitute to failure, not as a placebo, but as a genuine process so that the Israelis and Palestinians find the way to get out of the horrible deadlock, of the terrible impasse and the perpetual failures over decades, and together with the international community, design, agree, and implement to live side by side, each in their own state, in dignity, prosperity, and security, free from terror and insecurity. If not, even if this Hamas is dismantled, its ideology will remain, and if it's not abandoned or eradicated, plans will remain dreams, dreams will be crushed, and the harsh and unforgiving reality will perpetuate, and it will be, unfortunately, only a matter of time until the next tragedy unfolds. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to extend sincere condolences on behalf of the United Arab Emirates to the government and people of Kuwait on the passing of the late Emir, His Highness Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah. He was a true leader, a tireless advocate for peace in the region who championed humanitarian causes around the world. His loss will be felt the world over. Mr. President, I thank our briefers today, Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and Major General Patrick Gosha, for updating us on the situation on the ground. We are now coming to the end of what was the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory. This should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue, and this starts with the current situation in Gaza. Last week, many Security Council members witnessed a humanitarian system at its breaking point at the Rafah crossing. They saw thousands of trucks and warehouses filled with aid from people and governments around the world, the physical expression of their solidarity with the people of Gaza. Meanwhile, just over the border, 2.2 million people remain trapped, with 9 out of every 10 spending entire days without food. Gazans are experiencing unprecedented levels of starvation and thirst, while doctors lack even the most basic of medical supplies to treat the wounded and the growing threat of infection. What we need is access. The resolution that we will vote on later today aims to meet this need by demanding the use of all land, sea, and air routes to allow aid to enter. Israel must stop blocking the entry of aid and allow life-saving assistance into the Gaza Strip. The UAE notes the opening of the border crossing at Karam Abu Salim. We call on authorities to ensure its full opening, including to commercial cargo, so that aid can enter at scale. The entry of aid alone is not enough. Aid workers must not have to pay the ultimate price to carry out their life-saving work, and those accessing the aid must be able to do so without fearing for their safety. This is why we need the urgent and extended pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip as called for in Resolution 2712. Monitoring and verification are key to implementation. We welcome the Secretary General's letter to the Council yesterday providing options. We look forward to discussing these with fellow members of the Council and to their further elaboration by the UN Secretariat. Mr. President, a humanitarian ceasefire remains a fundamental necessity to bring the suffering in Gaza to an end. It will stop the bloodshed, allow for the safe and unhindered access for humanitarian aid, and offer an opportunity for hostages to be brought to safety. Meanwhile, less than 100 kilometers away from Gaza, people in the West Bank are living in a situation of violence and fear that has escalated over the past 2 months. Since 7 October, the number of people killed in the West Bank has increased. 278 Palestinians, including 70 children, have lost their lives. This is more than half of the total number since the beginning of the year, in a year that was already witnessing unprecedented levels of violence. The level of settler violence is disturbing and unrelenting, with 344 Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians in the past 2 months. This is unacceptable and must be stopped. Just because those with extremist voices shout the loudest does not mean that they should decide the fate of the region. We are also deeply concerned about reports of Israel approving a new illegal settlement in East Jerusalem, including 1,700 units. We reject and condemn in the strongest possible terms any attempt to exploit the ongoing war on Gaza to expand settlements and displace Palestinians from their land. This is also a grave violation of Resolution 2334. Not just an indictment of settlements, 2334 renewed the Council's commitment to the two-state solution and the parameters necessary for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The violence we are witnessing now across Gaza and the West Bank is a direct result of the lack of full implementation of 2334 and the absence of any meaningful political process. The past 2 months have made this crystal clear, as well as underlining the urgency of resolving the Palestinian question, a matter of priority for all of us. This is why we need a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution. The international community's commitment to the two-state solution is a responsibility we must all bear and a call to action we must all heed. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Ecuador. I'd like to thank Special Coordinator Tor Vennesland and Major General Patrick Gauchat for their briefings this morning, and I thank the Secretariat for the report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. I reiterate my country's support for the work of the United Nations, so valuable and selfless. The Secretary-General, in his report, describes the last 3-month period as the deadliest period for Israelis and Palestinians in the history of this conflict, and it summarizes the explosion of violence that began on the 7th of October with the heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, and this violence has continued to date with very serious, catastrophic consequences for civilians and for the humanitarian situation. This report paints a somber backdrop. We wish never to have received this backdrop. In addition to the situation in Gaza, it shows the alarming increase in violence in the West Bank, sometimes perpetrated by settlers, the continuation of illegal settlement building, and the increase in incendiary rhetoric, acts of provocation and incitement, including the unacceptable glorification of the assassination of civilians and terrorist acts. In a nutshell, this report summarizes a baleful period of terror, hatred, violence, and death, and it is also a warning and a call to action. Your Excellencies, colleagues, a few days ago I had the opportunity to visit the Rafah crossing on the border between Egypt and Gaza, together with other representatives of current and incoming members of the Council, and through the initiative of the UAE delegation and Egypt, whom I would like to thank. I personally was able to see the seriousness and the urgent nature of the humanitarian situation. We must continue our efforts to alleviate the suffering of civilians in Gaza. That is why we think it is critical that there be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to allow for the increase in the distribution of aid. We need to do everything we can to avoid more cases such as that of Wala, a young Palestinian lady, the mother of a son who died and another who was injured, who I met in hospital in Egypt during my visit. In this regard, Resolution 2712 and all other resolutions of the Council must be fully and completely implemented. We must also prevent the expansion of violence to other areas. We must therefore avoid acts of incitement, the language of hate, and the glorification of violence. We call on leaders to show responsibility and humanity. As the Secretary-General rightly states in his report, leaders have the obligation to clearly and explicitly condemn acts of terror and violence against civilians, clearly and explicitly. In addition, we are concerned to see the increase in hate speech, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism throughout the world. This is unacceptable. Once again, we call for rationality and responsibility to avoid the spreading of disinformation and hostility. Your Excellencies, to conclude, my country reiterates its commitment to peace, its call for a humanitarian ceasefire, and its condemnation of Hamas's terrorist attacks and violence against civilians, as well as our demand for the immediate unconditional liberation of all hostages. We also reiterate our conviction that the only way to end this conflict is through a peaceful, negotiated, lasting, fair solution for all parties with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and the pertinent resolutions. I now resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.